All right, well, hello everybody. It's so nice to see everyone here today. We have finally made it to the final class. So this session will come to an end. Hopefully you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. Today I have a little bit of a different spin on the normal class that I would have. So we're going to start out with a traditional class, but we're going to end on something a little different today. So hopefully I will manage to get that done on time. So with that said, we are going to talk about, because of talking about in World War I the invasion of Gallipoli, we are going to talk about the tools of invasion in World War II and, of course, other technological advances. So let's get started. So, Battle of Gallipoli, we talked about that. It demonstrated absolutely that to land an opposed beach was going to be a very, very difficult thing with the weapons of the Second Industrial Revolution, machine guns, etc. The only reason they even managed to land is the fact that their beaches are virtually undefended by the standards we'd expect later on in the war, or in World War II particularly. So, for example, you see the Australian and New Zealand troops landing in rowboats. No motors, they rowed ashore. No defense, nothing. Had these people been landing at an invasion beach, perhaps like in World War II in the Pacific at Tarawa, this would have been a complete disaster. Nobody would have gotten ashore. They would have all been immediately destroyed and killed trying to land in that manner. Well, still, even with very, very little defense capability that the Turks had, this invasion is not successful in any way. And the reason it's not successful is they do not move forward quickly. They do not bring in equipment that they should have brought in. The Turks are able to come and defend those beaches because they are on land. They don't have a problem moving forward. And what happens is, of course, they don't achieve their objectives. So the Battle of Gallipoli is definitely what we would consider a major failure. Well, that failure calls into question all amphibious landings after that point. So people start to think, well, in the face of real defenses, how would these people be able to stop an invasion? It would be easy. It would be easy to defeat an invasion with modern weaponry. So something needs to be done to change that. And Gallipoli showed another thing, too, that there's a huge difference between trying to invade a continent and trying to invade an island. And we'll talk about this in detail. But to invade an island, the island is surrounded. Naval power most likely has control of the sea around that island, and you cannot reinforce it, you cannot resupply it. On a continent, it's completely different. On a continent, I can use roads, railroads, etc. to bring forces in to begin to defeat that invasion. If I can defeat that invasion, it comes down to a race. How quickly can you land troops and land supplies and land what you need for an actual invasion, and how fast can the enemy, using land, bring in supplies, more men, etc. So that race to see who can build up faster is going to be a key when you invade a continent. And I'll just make a brief comment about islands. When we look at island invasions, particularly in the Pacific, when we looked at those invasions, it was simply those islands had no capability to resupply. There is an exception to that, and that's the Battle of Guadalcanal. At Guadalcanal, the United States had control of the sea during the daytime. At nighttime, the Japanese had control of the sea, so both sides could continue to bring in more troops and to reinforce that. It is only when the United States can dominate the ocean more than the Japanese that that 6-month battle ends. So you see, even on islands, if you can reinforce an island, those battles will be greatly extended. So that's why this is always a race. Well, after World War I, the British, because they are a sea power, needed to understand how they could use land forces, because always the British policy would be simply that they would land the British Army, and then the British Army would do whatever it needed to do on land. So they're very, very concerned as a sea power on how to develop a capability to land on an opposed beach. And they come up with some ideas. They basically are working towards the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines will be there to train, to learn, and they start to create much more effective landing craft than we saw with those rowboats. And the first one, they actually becomes, I'd say, the progenitor of modern landing craft is the British motor landing craft from 1926. As you can see in this picture, it has a very shallow draft. It doesn't have much water, so it can get very close to shore. It has a ramp that comes down. It has protection around its propeller, so it can get in close to shore without damaging that propeller. So many of the aspects of this craft from 1926 will be the same type of craft that we will see being used so much in World War II, and somewhat to today as well. So they really have worked a lot on trying to do this thing. But the British also have another thought process, and they think that a landing on a continent particularly has to be a surprise. You have to surprise the enemy so they cannot bring up reinforcements quickly. Because if they can bring up reinforcements quickly, indeed, they will then win that race. So they decide what they are going to do is they are going to have a night landing by commandos. Commandos will land in the dark. They will try to sneak on. They will try to attack artillery positions and machine gun nests, etc., to clear some of that area for the beach. And then what will happen after that is when daylight comes, the main landing will take place, hopefully in much less opposition. So again, it's all about surprise with the British. So that's what their thinking is, which is vastly different than what we'll see in the Pacific, of course. Well, the Marine Corps, after World War I, is looking for a mission. The Marine Corps was primarily used in World War I as infantry on land in France. And the Marines are very concerned that indeed they will be out of a job. They will be actually incorporated into the United States Army because that's how they've been functioning. So that is where the Marine Corps is looking for something new to do. And fortunately, because of a thing we've talked about before, War Plan Orange, which would be fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, War Plan Orange will give them this opportunity. And it's simply enough this, that as the U.S. fleet moves forward towards Japan, they will need island bases because the presupposition is that they will lose the Philippines. So the only major naval base at that point we will have in the Pacific will be in Hawaii. That's too far away for a Mahanian-style sea battle off the coast of Japan. So they are going to need, as they move further and further along, they are going to need to capture bases that they can use for replenishment and repairing ships, etc. So what happens then is they're going to need a plan how to do this. And that's going to be part of this gentleman here, Major Pete Ellis. Major Pete Ellis in 1920 writes a manifesto of 30,000 words, and it is called Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia. And he really predicts very, very accurately how these battles will be fought in the Pacific in World War II. He says, for example, you're going to need to take an island, you're going to need to be able to have control of the sea around it, you're going to need to have a major bombardment of that island. The island is defended, you're going to need to rush troops ashore as quickly as possible to limit casualties. You're going to need to land tanks. You're going to need to land machine guns. You're going to need to land light artillery. All these things are going to be critical, and he also predicts that air power will be important in this regard as well. So Pete is really, really on top of his game as far as understanding what's going to happen in World War II taking these islands. And another thing that he says is if the island has artillery capability, like we would look at Tarawa, I'd like to use that example again. At Tarawa, there's two problems. Landing craft can't actually get close to the shore because there is a reef. And many islands in the Pacific have these reefs. So how do you get ashore? They developed something called the Amtrak. It is basically an armored personnel carrier that can actually swim ashore, has tracks that it can then go over the reef, and most importantly, it is semi-armored, so it can defend against small arms fire, and that would limit casualties. So the Amtrak becomes very, very important for the U.S. in these island battles. But as far as Europe goes, it actually is not that important, because they're going to use something completely different. Yes?
When did somebody figure out that we could not defend the Philippines? How early was that notion formulated?
The question is how early did we decide we could not defend the Philippines? The thinking actually goes back and forth. So as early as, I believe, the original War Plan Orange dates to about 1906, what would happen is they would think, well, maybe they should all go into Bataan. They could make a defensive stand in Bataan, and that would deny Cavite Harbor to the Japanese. Then when they decide to come up with the Rainbow Plans in the 30s, they decide that the Philippines is indefensible, and so that it's going to be lost. Then MacArthur basically talks the U.S. government into saying, I'm going to build a Philippine army so we can defend the Philippines, and it goes back and forth over the years. But basically, they are fairly confident that even if they don't lose the entire chain of islands, they will not be able to use Cavite and Manila as a naval base. So either way, it doesn't matter for this point. Okay? Well, we are probably most familiar with this vehicle. It is the LCVP, that is the Landing Craft Vehicle and Personnel. This is an iconic picture, really, of our vehicle. Many, many other types of landing craft are developed at this time. A large one would be the landing ship tank, the LCT, the landing craft tank, and there's just multiple types, but they all have similar ideas to that British unit I talked about previously. And the idea of these things is they're shallow draft, they can get ashore, drop a ramp, and they are going to then disperse either a vehicle or troops in the case of this unit. And this one actually comes from a guy, Andrew Higgins. And Andrew Higgins actually is based out of New Orleans. He's an entrepreneur. And he decides that he's going to make boats that are useful around New Orleans, where it's very swampy and shallow to do whatever, shrimping or other things. And the Navy sees these boats, and the Marines see these boats. And they said, you know, these are pretty cool boats, Andrew. We really like what you got going here. And they decide to buy a few. And they buy a few, and they're happy with them. But the problem with them is, at this point, is when you want to get out of the boat, you have to climb over the side, or if you want to take supplies out of the boat, you have to lug them over the side. Well, there's a Japanese unit called a Daihatsu that the Marines are familiar with. And they go to Andrew and say, you know, Andrew, if you put a ramp on the front of this boat, this would be a hell of a lot better boat. And indeed, Andrew redesigns it and puts a ramp on, basically using a Japanese design, and they come up with this very famous LCVP. And how famous is it? General Dwight D. Eisenhower, I think we're all familiar with him, says, Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed on an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. So indeed, probably a little overstatement, but the fact of the matter is these boats were incredibly important. Okay, well now we have the situation of, well, what is going on in the world in 1942? And the situation is the Allies want to invade France. They need to make a little test, though, before they try to do this. And that test is going to be at the port of Dieppe. It is going to be called Operation Jubilee. So there is London, there is the English Channel, there is Dieppe. Dieppe is between Pas-de-Calais, and it is between Normandy. So it is a port city on the English Channel. And the idea is they're going to attack this thing with about 6,000 troops, 5,000 Canadian soldiers, and 1,000 commandos. And the idea is to hold this port, not to capture it, but just to hold it for 24 to 48 hours. And then, of course, they can do some damage. There's going to try to steal some German radars, which they actually do. And it's an idea that it's going to boost morale, and it's going to show the world that the United States and Britain are committed to an invasion of France eventually. So that's the idea of this whole thing. Well, a lot of people, including Bernard Montgomery, Monty you may be familiar with, says, you know, I don't think this is a really good idea. I think this could be a lot of problems. And certain aspects, and it's surprising, one of the key aspects of people that are pushing for this raid is going to be the RAF. Why would the RAF want to have this raid? The RAF wants to have this raid because they're hoping to draw the German Luftwaffe close to the port so they can destroy it. Because remember, German fighters have a short range, but the Spitfire and the Hurricanes are also very short range too. So this way they will put them in range of British air power so they can begin to shoot down German planes. So the RAF is way into this thing. Other major piece is what's going on in Russia. In Russia, of course, the Russians are nearly defeated in 1941. It's only an incredible stand in front of Moscow in December that keeps the Germans from winning the war in 1941. By 1942, in the springtime and summer, the Germans are launching a major offensive in Russia. That offensive is to go south to capture the oil fields of Baku and will eventually end up in the terrible Battle of Stalingrad. But the Russians, again, are being beaten by the Germans. And in order to show support for them and show the Russians that indeed we're committed to helping you, they are going to launch this raid, basically to just keep the Russians from abandoning the war, because they're very, very concerned that the Russians are actually going to sue for peace at this point. So there's a couple of things that are going on there. And they're going to use the typical British strategy of landing commandos at night, no pre-invasion bombardment, and the commandos are then to capture the area. There's 1,000 commandos. They're to cut out the gun emplacements and to reduce the machine gun nests, and then they're going to land 5,000 Canadians the next morning. And again, they only want to hold this port for a day or two. Well, what happens is, this is a complete disaster. It is so bad, it's just amazingly bad. First of all, fire support. So in the morning, when they need fire support from the Navy, the British Navy only commits 6 Hunt-class destroyers to this entire invasion. They are only armed with 4-inch guns. This is completely inadequate to capture a fortified port. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the commandos aren't particularly effective knocking out German gun emplacements. They can't find them all. They don't know where they are. The reconnaissance is bad. So that is a disaster, and when the Canadians begin to land on these beaches, they are literally getting slaughtered. So it demonstrates definitely that they are not able to, at this time, capture a port or even make an effective landing. And the problems are numerous, but how bad are the losses? You land 5,000 Canadian soldiers, you lose 3,367 of them either killed, captured, or wounded. They only hold the port, they don't even really hold it, but after 10 hours they're forced to evacuate it. 70% casualties for them. The commandos, almost 25% casualties for the commandos. So again, the casualty level is terrible. Virtually nothing goes right in this entire attack. And it's a disaster. So if you see this picture, you see wounded Canadians on the beach. You see a Churchill tank. Why is that Churchill tank on the beach? The fact of the matter is this beach is made of shale. And the tank cannot get enough traction, even with tank treads, to get up that beach. So the tanks are totally ineffective. You also see to the left of the tank a burning landing craft because we don't knock out the German artillery. So this whole thing is just a mess. But what do they learn from this? They learn that they're going to need a whole line of specialized armored vehicles in order to make these types of landings. They're going to need the RAF to learn how to use tactical air power to support the ground troops, because the RAF does a terrible job. They need also to understand that they can't just land on a beach and assume it's a beach. They need to send, at the time, what they would refer to as frogmen, to sneak onto the beach, take samples of the sand, to do quality reconnaissance, and then they could have an idea of what they actually need to conquer that beach. So all these things need to be learned, but the most single important thing I believe that they learn at Dieppe is the fact that it is going to be virtually impossible to capture a port because ports are just so well defended. Well, after the Dieppe raid and a raid at Saint Nazaire, Hitler is very, very concerned. He thinks that this is going to be a problem in the future. And so he decides what they're going to do is they're going to create what is called the Atlantic Wall. He is going to fortify the coast all the way from Spain to Norway, with primary emphasis on ports. Well, this is going to be a mighty big job to do this. And then Rommel comes into the picture, and Rommel begins to look at what they're doing and says, this is completely inadequate. You can't do it this way. You're going to need to be able to defeat that invasion on the beach, because once the Allies land on the beach, their air power is so effective that you will not be able to bring up the reinforcements you need to win that race. And that's a critical piece with this. So Rommel thinks what we're going to do is we're going to put what looks like jacks, to me, all along the beach. These are steel I-beams that are welded together. Some of them have a mine on top to prevent landing craft from getting onto the beach. They are going to put up what's known as Rommel's asparagus. He's afraid of airborne landings by gliders. Remember, the Germans used that very effectively in Belgium to start the war. So he begins to plant poles in fields. So when gliders would land, of course, they would hit the pole and smash up. So that would prevent glider landings. He's also a huge proponent of landmines. And he wants to put literally millions of landmines on the beaches, and particularly the exits from beaches in France particularly, and all the way again from Spain to Norway. So it's a gigantic undertaking, but a problem the Germans also have is they don't have the manpower to do this. So the Germans, because they've been at war now for 6 years, don't have the capability to have the forces they need to defend this giant area because they're fighting in Russia. So what are they going to do? They are going to create what they will call static divisions that will be primarily staffed by people from Turkestan, Russia, Mongolia, and as we see in this top picture, from India. Because some of these Indians wanted to overthrow British rule of India, so they would volunteer to become troops for the Nazis. So these are not very effective units, though, particularly some of the Ost or East units. Those units, some of them came this way. I was captured. I'm a Russian. I was captured. And I'm in a German prisoner of war camp, and I'm not a big fan of Stalin, and I make that well known. But the other problem is I'm being treated horribly. I'm starving to death. And the Germans come along and say, hey, you know, if you join the German army, guess what? We're going to feed you, we're going to clothe you, and you're going to be out of this prisoner of war camp. And that's a hell of a good deal rather than starving to death being in this prisoner of war camp, so it would seem at the time. Doesn't necessarily work out well at the end of the war, but regardless, they volunteer. Now, are these highly motivated troops? Are these people that you could count on and trust? Of course not. And second of all, they're going to arm them with cast-off weapons from France, from Poland, and other countries that they have defeated. They're not going to give them necessarily German weapons. They're going to give them whatever they have available just to flesh out this giant defensive thing. And these static divisions are virtually immobile. They don't have a lot of trucks, they don't have tanks, they don't have anything. They're just there to be static and hold these beaches. Then what is going to happen is the Germans have some very, very high quality units that they're going to use to be the counterattack units. And that would be perhaps the 21st Panzer Division, which is stationed near Normandy and does a fantastic job really with what it has to work with. The 12th SS Panzer, the Hitlerjugend. The Hitlerjugend is a highly motivated, highly equipped, excellent unit that fights very, very effectively in Normandy. So they do have some good units available to supplement these, in quotes, volunteers. Well, I talked about having some new types of armor capability and new types of tanks. And that brings us to Sir Percy Hubbard. And Percy's an interesting character. In 1940, he's a general. He's literally drummed out of the British Army. They basically force his retirement because he can't get along with the British High Command. And he goes and becomes a private in a home guard unit. That would be a little town organization that is afraid of being invaded by the Germans. You might watch a show called Dad's Army from BBC, and you have an idea of what the home guard was like. But he does such an incredible job organizing his little town that he becomes the head of an entire region of home guard units. And at this point, he starts to get some notoriety again. Also, it helps that his brother-in-law is Bernard Montgomery, or Monty. He's married to Monty's sister. That doesn't hurt his career. Churchill finds out about the fact that he's been drummed out of the military, and Churchill says basically, you know, really we kind of need everybody we can get here, so it might be a good idea to reinstate him as a general. And indeed they do, and they put him in charge of a new training division for an armored division. He trains this division very, very well. But when it comes to deploy that division, he is taken out of command because, in quote, he is too old, and they don't trust him because he's very strange. And they say, okay, you're out of here. We give this command to somebody else. But they're going to give him something else. They're going to give him command of the new 79th Armored Engineering Division. And this division will be composed of tanks that are specialized for beach and certain other engineering tasks. He's a little reluctant to take this on initially, but he does take it on. And indeed, this will become known as Hubbard's Funnies. And these tanks are very, very interesting that they use different types of tanks to do different types of engineering jobs. For example, there is the flail tank. You take a tank, you put a giant drum on the front of it. The drum is turned by a motor. On that drum are chains, so it beats the ground in front of the tank and clears landmines. He creates another tank I think is very interesting, would have been incredibly useful at Dieppe. He creates the bobbin tank. And the bobbin tank has a giant spool of canvas with reinforced steel rods in it, and as the tank rolls along, it creates its own roadway. And then it leaves that roadway in place for other vehicles to follow. He creates the crocodile tank, which is a flamethrower tank, which is highly effective in short-range situations. And of course, there's tanks that make bridges, there's tanks that drop fascines into anti-tank ditches so they can cross over. So he makes all these different types of tanks. The United States does not view any of these tanks, except for one, to be worthwhile. And that will cost us some issues at Normandy. But the tank they think is worthwhile is this tank. It is the duplex drive D.D. Sherman, or commonly known as the Donald Duck tank. And the idea of this tank is it can go into water, deep water, and sail onto shore to support infantry in the initial stages of an invasion. And the way this thing works, it's really kind of interesting. If you look at here, this is the flotation screen down. So this tank is ready to fight. When it's going into battle on the sea, they raise this flotation of canvas and rubber inserts, and it floats along on the water. And then because it has duplex drive, you can see the two propellers. You disconnect the transmission from the treads, and you put the transmission to run these two propellers, and then it motivates itself to slow you to shore. So it can literally accompany infantry directly onto a beach from the ocean. So it's a really good idea. It doesn't particularly come into great, in the United States particularly, we have a very, very harsh opinion of this vehicle. And that's primarily because there were some problems with it being used. But on D-Day, there are actually 8 battalions of these things deployed. The Canadians have them, the British have them, we have them at Omaha and at Utah Beach. And actually at Utah Beach, 27 of 28 that are launched actually make it to shore no problem and do assist in the invasion. They're very effective, with some losses, of course, with the British and the Canadians. But the disaster happens at Omaha Beach. And the disaster is simply this. They are not dropped off directly in front of their beach that they need to land on. They are dropped off to the side. So in order to get where they need to go, they have to go across. When they go across the waves, and it's much more choppy than they expected it to be that day, the waves begin to lap over the screens, and the screens begin to collapse, and of course the tanks sink. Of all the ones launched at Omaha, only 2 make it to shore, and that is because those 2 tank drivers realized that they couldn't go across, and they just went straight in. Even though they were in the wrong position, they did get those tanks ashore. So the question is, did any of the crews get out? Yes, many of the crews get out. But the fact of the matter is there's also relatively significant losses, but probably, I don't know the exact number, but it's less than you would expect. The majority do escape. Believe me, I think when you're in that tank and that flotation device up, you're probably sitting pretty close to the exit. So, there were some severe losses, but indeed, a lot of guys did get out of those when they sank. And they've kind of taken a very bad rap historically, because I think had they been used effectively at Omaha, I think that the losses at Omaha would have been much less. But indeed, that's kind of the way it goes. Well, the other piece is, as we've talked about this buildup, the logistics issue of trying to have this type of a battle. And logistic issue is this simply, if I can't capture a port, I'm going to bring a port with me. And that will be the famous Mulberry Harbors. So the British decide they're going to have to make a port to take with them to invade Europe. And indeed, this is what this thing looks like. So it's going to take the place of using thousands of landing craft to bring in supplies eventually. And this is a tremendous undertaking, really. On D-Day, there are 400 units of different types being dragged across the channel, 1.5 million tons of harbor material that they are going to use. So what they're going to do is they're going to make caissons, giant concrete caissons that are going to be used as piers. Those piers are going to be connected, those of you familiar with Lake Martin, with floating roadways that work exactly the same way as a floating dock works at the lake to go up and down with the tide. So they will use those caissons, the ships will dock on them, they will then use floating roadways to get supplies directly onto that beach. They also have the capability to make a breakwater. They use 64 ships, obsolete, ships that they don't really need, to make a giant breakwater. There's going to be 2 of these ports, one for the US, one for the British. And ships like the dreadnought battleship, the HMS Centurion, which fought at Jutland, is actually expended here as a breakwater in order to keep the wave action down. Now there's a giant storm and it destroys the American port. So the American port is never used. But the port that the British build actually supplies 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies in its 10 months operation period. This really helps the Allies supply the Normandy invasion significantly. And I know a lot of people think this wasn't worthwhile because actually the US using landing craft actually supplies the Mulberry, believe it or not. But of course, there wouldn't be enough landing craft to do both beaches at the same time. So that's why I think that argument isn't really very accurate. The other big thing is going to be surprise. The British really like surprise. They think this is the key to winning this battle. And indeed, what they're going to do is they're going to have this deception plan. It's going to be called Operation Fortitude. They're going to try to deceive the Germans in this manner. The Germans think that they're going to attack at Pas-de-Calais. That's the most logical place for an invasion. So they need to find a way to convince the Germans that they are going to attack Pas-de-Calais even after they have invaded in Normandy. Now, how are they going to do that? They're going to create a fictitious unit called the 1st U.S. Army Group. They're going to put, theoretically, George Patton in charge of an army group that does not exist. They're going to use radio nets as if there's divisions communicating within the division. So the Germans will intercept the radios thinking, indeed, there are divisions there, but there aren't. And most importantly, they're going to use diplomatic leaks and what's known as the double-cross system. And the double-cross system is German agents that have either been turned into double agents or German agents that were recruited and then turn themselves over to the British and say, I don't want to be a German agent, but for a few bucks I'd be glad to work for you and help you deceive the Germans. And this is an incredibly effective thing. And the Germans actually believe that the invasion of Normandy is just a ruse, that indeed they're going to actually afterwards, after it draws the German forces down there, they're going to invade at Pas-de-Calais. Of course, that's not what's going to happen. And I love this rubber inflatable Sherman tank. I'd really like to own one of those myself. I think it would be a hell of a lot more fun than a jumpy house, but probably a little hard to come by one. Well, why don't we take a really short break? I've got a lot more to cover here. And I would like to end this class on time and with some perhaps discussion. So let's try to keep this. I want to definitely start well before 1:30, please. Anyway, they've lost the capability to transport by rail. The Tactical Air Force also is going to do a tremendous job. They are going to prevent the Germans from using roads during the daytime. So now the only way the Germans can transport to win that race, to defeat that invasion, is to transport people at night on roads. And that's a big problem. When people try to do daylight transportation, they have problems. For example, Erwin Rommel is severely injured by Allied fighter aircraft transporting in the daytime. Whitman, who is probably the greatest panzer ace of all time, is killed in his Tiger tank by a British Typhoon firing rockets. So indeed, daylight movement by German forces against Allied tactical air supremacy is a very, very problematic issue. As far as the French goes, they lost 10,000 Frenchmen are killed in these attacks. Certainly less than 40,000, but indeed they paid a heavy price. Yes, Alan?
Was the resistance still bombing these yards and all the kinds of things they had been doing?
The resistance was indeed attacking rails, bridges primarily, and isolated tracks. These were in cities, and I don't think...
Even after Normandy? That was
Oh, yes, absolutely.
okay.
Yes. Though I think the resistance frequently is vastly overrated. It becomes, I hate to use this term, but the ability of the French resistance, and I don't want to talk about this a lot, becomes really an urban legend. It really makes France look good after the war, indeed, if there's all this resistance fighting going on, but I don't believe that really was the case. In fact, it got to the point where we would literally ask them not to blow things up because they were more valuable giving information than causing damage, what little damage they caused to the Germans. So anyway, next big thing, of course, on the night of D-Day is landing troops by air. This is the airborne divisions. They are going to land a total of 23,000 men in a matter of 12 hours. These are primarily landed at night. They are the 82nd and 101st U.S. Airborne Divisions. They are the 6th British Airborne Divisions. And the initial plan for D-Day is not to use them at all. But Montgomery, who has been put in charge of the D-Day operation, the tactical side, says, indeed, what we need to do is we need to use these airborne divisions. And indeed, they do use them, and to pretty good effect. The problem is the landing these people at night, and it's cloudy, they are scattered all over the place. They're not concentrated properly. They're not dropped, many of them, in the correct spots. But it's amazing capability that these troops had, how motivated they were and how good they were, is little tiny groups of these men would go on to create havoc in the German lines and actually do the job they were intended to do as badly as they were deployed by the Air Force to put them in position. A couple of key highlights of this would be the Pegasus Bridge attack by the British. This is a glider-borne attack, much like Ibn Emil we saw in Belgium. These gliders land at night right next to the bridge, and they capture a key bridge over the Caen Canal, which is a very, very important place to hold. Of course, the 82nd Airborne Division, of course, if you've seen the movie The Longest Day, they capture St. Mary-Glees, which is a very critical road junction in this area as well. So the U.S. and the British are holding the flanks, preventing the Germans from being able to concentrate quickly against the invasion. And if you think about this, this is 41 years after the Wright brothers. So the advantage of the incredible technology leap for the Second Industrial Revolution is really amazing, that you could go from the Wright brothers to landing 23,000 men in such a short time is really, to me, pretty amazing. And I decided to use the gliders because I thought everybody knows what a parachutist looks like, so I thought the gliders were more fun. Yes, sir?
Frank, did the pilots just basically become infantrymen after they landed?
The question is, did the pilots of gliders become infantrymen after they landed? The answer actually is they were not supposed to. Indeed, they were sometimes forced to be that, but they were evacuated as quickly as possible because they were highly trained and they did not want to lose them in that manner. So basically, the pilots of these things did not fight on the ground if they could avoid it. Next, of course, is the bombardment phase 2, and the bombing of Normandy is going to be by strategic bombers again, and strategic bombers are going to drop bombs theoretically on the beach. As we've talked about many times in this class, bombers have a difficult time finding things at night, and indeed it's cloudy and most of these bombs miss by miles. So the beach defenses are relatively untouched by the strategic bombing. In the morning, bombers are beginning to use tactical weapons. There's only really one very effective use at Utah Beach. Most of the bombers are afraid of hitting their own men and drop their bombs too far inland. So the bombing of these beaches is pretty ineffective. The next piece is the naval bombardment. And again, remember, this is primarily on British thinking. Because they want to invade a continent, they have to do this quickly and not draw attention to it for the Germans. So the bombardment by the naval bombardment is very, very short. It's not like in Pacific where in like Iwo Jima they shelled it for 3-4 days continuously. No. At Omaha Beach, for example, they are only going to have a 40-minute bombardment. Now, they have a decent amount of ships. They've got 5 battleships, 2 monitors, 16 cruisers, and 65 destroyers to do shore bombardment. So indeed, they have a lot of capability, but if you're only going to bombard for 40 minutes, that's not going to do the job. And it doesn't do the job particularly at Omaha. The bombardment there is extremely ineffective. And of course, we've lost all our tanks. So Omaha becomes a mess. It is a bloodbath for our troops landing on that beach. And really, it is destroyers that save Omaha Beach from being a complete disaster. Destroyers sailed in so close to that beach that they were literally dragging their keels on the ocean bottom. They were then called in by radio, certainly another advantage of the Second Industrial Revolution, to pinpoint targets, but at point-blank range. And they were so close, in fact, that one destroyer saw one of those 2 tanks on the beach firing on a position. And they said, okay, if he's firing over there, we're going to fire over there. And they start to shell that position with 5-inch guns at point-blank range, and of course destroy it very quickly. So indeed, it is those few destroyers that are willing to take that chance and sail into that close range that save Omaha Beach at this time. When we look at the entire plan for Normandy invasion, you can see the 5 beaches there. They have had 2 years, basically, plus to plan this organization. They have used the best technology they possibly have. They have complete air supremacy. They have complete naval supremacy. Yes?
Did they go in at high tide or low tide?
They went in at low tide.
More beach.
More beach, and the Germans assumed they would not do that. The reason they went in at low tide rather than high tide was the fact that they wanted to see those beach obstacles and then to use engineers to defuse the mines on them. So that's why they went in. The Germans expected them not to do that. They expected to have as little beach as possible. So they kind of crossed them up on that. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that we've got all this capability to beat the Germans on this offensive. All this effort has gone into this, including the deception that Hitler doesn't actually send his best divisions that he has up by Pas de Calais for several weeks. And still, units like the 21st Panzer Division nearly breaks through at Sword and Juno Beach all the way to the coast. So when we look at the objectives for the first day, the capture of Karatin, the capture of Bayeux, the capture of Caen, a linking of the beaches for these 4, not the 5th, but these 4, and a 6 to 10 mile penetration on day 1, none of those are achieved. So it seems to us that indeed this was an easier thing than it actually was, but in fact, D-Day is not easy by any means, and certainly even with all this capability, it's much, much more difficult than people ever thought it was going to be. Well, let us briefly talk about some scientific pieces here. And I'd like to talk about this aircraft, which is, and I believe that means hands off or no hands, don't touch. Yeah, no hands. Nicht anfassen.
Anfassen, yeah.
Yeah, no hands, don't touch. So anyway, what happens here is they make this thing started in 1936. It's a highly effective little weapon. It's surprisingly inexpensive. And the way this thing is designed to be artillery, kind of like we talked about the V2. Because the Germans are not allowed to have artillery because of the Treaty of Versailles. So they decide they're going to make this cruise missile. And it is indeed the world's first cruise missile. It has a very, very large warhead for as small as it is. It's very small, really. It has a 1,870-pound warhead. It can fly 160 miles, and it uses a pulse jet. Those of you that are unfamiliar with a pulse jet, it is a jet that has virtually no moving parts. You force air into it to get it started. It just uses a conventional spark plug. Fuel is mixed in with that air, and when that fuel explodes, there is basically, it looks sort of like a Venetian blind. From the explosion, the Venetian blind closes, and that forces the exhaust out the rear. So it's a very, very simple engine. It's not a particularly fuel-efficient engine, hence the short range. But the fact of the matter is, it packs a nice punch. It can go 400 miles an hour, but it can't take off by itself. It has to be launched off a ski slope, or it has to be dropped from an airplane. So, or not a ski slope, a catapult would be a better term. They called them ski slopes. So the catapult launches this thing. Directions, you basically aimed it in the general direction of where you wanted it to go. It had a very simple gyroscopic system to guide it to that position. And if you see here, this spinner, that spinner would spin when it spun enough times. That was the time for the bomb to drop and to hit the ground. It had a circular error probability of about 13 miles originally. They actually get that down to about 7 miles. So it's anything but an accurate weapon, but it can hit a city. And it's a vengeance weapon. Well, the V1 is incredibly cost effective. It's amazingly cost effective when you think about this. I did the math on this, and in 2020 US dollars, it cost $11,000 to make one of these. It carried 1,870 pound bomb load. So indeed, it was about $5.75 per pound to drop this thing in 2020 dollars. I told you last time that it cost 1945 British pound for pound of explosives dropped by the RAF, Strategic Bomber Command. Indeed, if we convert that to 2020 dollars, which I had neglected to do last week, that would come to $56 per pound dropped. So this thing is much, much cheaper than dropping bombs from an airplane with all the costs involved. So even though it's a one-shot weapon, it's actually quite effective. Well, the next big thing, of course, is going to be the V2, and the V2 is a much more complicated weapon. This is a liquid fuel rocket. It is the contemporary of, or the progenitor of the ICBMs and IRBMs that we use today, and indeed it is the first thing ever to get man-made to get into outer space. How does this thing work? It has a liquid-fueled engine. It fires up into the sky. It goes 50 miles up in the air. Then the engine shuts off, and it begins to descend to the target at that time. 2,200 pounds worth of warhead, and it is a pretty effective weapon, really. And it drops in at 1,790 miles per hour. There is absolutely no defense against this weapon in World War II, none. Once it is launched, nothing is going to stop it. There is some thought process that they could use massive amounts of anti-aircraft fire if they knew exactly where it was coming from, but I would speculate that that's very, very iffy at best. Certainly not very cost effective. 200-mile range. Guidance is the nozzles actually turn, and it has little control tabs on the fins, the 4 big fins there. And I think one of the other more interesting things about this weapon is it needs absolutely no infrastructure to launch it. It is completely self-contained. All you need to know is where you are exactly in relationship to your target, and then that thing is launched on that line, and it will hit with about a circular error probability of about 7 miles. So once again, it cannot hit a pinpoint target by any means, but it can hit a city. And indeed, it does hit cities. So full production really is supposed to take place in 1943. Remember, they started building the idea of this thing in 1932. So they're starting to build it and test it at a place called Peenemünde. And Peenemünde, due to spies, German traders, and radio intelligence, is found out by the British to be where they are testing and building these missiles. And they launch a major bombing raid at Peenemünde. They destroy a lot of the area. They kill 2 of the key scientists involved with creation of the engine, and they also kill many of the workers that are going to build this thing. At that point, the Germans decide what they're going to move is the entire production of this is going to go underground into mines. And they are going to use concentration camp inmates to run those and build these things. Well, in the use of this thing, and they made 6,048 of these, more people die making them in the concentration camp inmates than are actually killed by this. About 6,000 people are killed by these things. But I think what the most unusual part about this thing is to build one of these in 2020 dollars cost $4,349,000 to make one of these weapons. They made 6,048 of them. They launched, like I said, about 3,000. So when you look at 2,200 pounds, and you see the cost is $4,349,000, it costs approximately $1,975 per pound to drop explosives on London. This is not a very effective or cost-effective weapon at all. It does a tremendous amount of damage, don't get me wrong, but it's strictly a terror weapon. It is not a weapon that is going to realistically have an effect on the outcome of the war. It's designed to two things. It's designed to punish the British for their bombing of German cities, and it's also designed to encourage the German people and their few remaining allies that indeed these miracle weapons will change the war, that indeed the outcome of the war will be changed by these weapons. And of course, it actually has absolutely no effect on World War II whatsoever. The only effect it actually does have is the Germans spend it depends who you read, they spend nearly as much or more than we spent on the Manhattan Project to build this weapon. So we got an atomic bomb, they've got what eventually will become used to carry atomic bombs. But at this point, it strictly only carries explosives. So when we started this class, we talked about kill zones. And I talked about the fact that the British longbow at the Battle of Agincourt had a range, effective range of 220 yards. And when I think about that, I think about the vast majority of fighting actually at Agincourt was done hand to hand. So we are literally at blows face to face. Of course, the King of England, Henry V, is also there as well, fighting in the front ranks. So if you think about it, you got the King of England, who's also the head of the army at the same time, and fighting with the troops. Certainly a big change from today. As time goes by, we get to the gunpowder revolution, and at Waterloo, we see that an effective range for a cannon is probably about 600 yards, and a realistic killing range is probably about 900 yards. But again, that's with the gunpowder revolution. By the time we get to the American Civil War, which we talked about, the range of killing has gone from, with muzzle-loading rifles from 100 yards, muzzle-loading smoothbores from 100 yards to muzzle-loading rifles of an effective range of about 300 yards. So that killing range has gotten much further as well. At that time, we're starting to see rifled cannon. If you can see a target with a rifled cannon at this time firing black powder, it can indeed hit a target 2.5 miles away. So again, the battlefield is getting much larger. Also, the population of the planet, as we talked about, is getting much larger. Armies are getting huge, much larger than they ever were. Why is that? We saw a population increase go from 700 million people in 1750 to today it's 7.7 billion people. So the population growth due to the first and second industrial revolution is also gigantic. So armies are much, much bigger. And by the time we get to World War, or actually before World War I, we start to look at the smokeless powder is created. That's 3 times more powerful than gunpowder. And they begin to use steel-barreled and steel shells for weapons. The range now becomes exponentially greater. So you see the Paris cannon being able to fire a range of 75 miles. The problem, of course, is the ability to hit something at that range takes significantly longer. It is not until 1905, 1910, where optical rangefinders and the analog computers that are used on naval vessels begin to be able to hit targets at those extreme ranges. Indirect fire, in other words, firing over a hill where I can't see where my shells are landing, that's really not completed until the creation of the radio in the 1920s. So again, even though we have all these capabilities, range and size of militaries gets larger and larger and longer, and the battlefield just gets bigger. By the way, I would venture to say that it's extremely easier to make that longbow than it is to make that B-29 bomber underneath it. I would bet on that. And there's a hell of a lot more involved with making that B-29 than making that longbow. And so what's going to happen now is the manufacture, the ability to make these weapons of war that are so much more capable becomes a job for basically nation states. The complexity of society has gotten so large to make these scientifically inspired and engineering and designed weapons it now makes people want to do something different. You not only attack the army of the enemy, you need to attack the nation of the enemy. You need to deny them the ability to create these complicated weapons. And indeed, that is going to be one of the things that leads to total war. And simply enough, in World War I, how are we going to do that? We're going to use blockade. We're going to prevent the Germans, and the Germans are trying to do the same thing with submarines to the British. We're going to prevent them from two things: getting raw materials that they need to make these complicated weapons, and we're also going to prevent them from eating. So we're going to starve the population out so they cannot make these weapons. So the attack becomes not just on the armies and the militaries and the navies of these units, it becomes the attack on the entire nation state. That is what we look at as total war today. When we get to World War II, indeed, blockade is going to be the same. But there's going to be a new thing being used, and that's going to be air power. And air power is going to, as you well know, is going to have a tremendous effect on the ability to try to destroy the housing of the people that make these weapons, not to mention kill quite a few of them as well. But the fact of the matter is, it's designed to make them revolt against their government because they are so miserable. They have no place to live. A roving band of refugees cannot create these weapons. And that is indeed total war to a new level of bombardment of cities. Well, I said we're going to do something a little different, and I have a few minutes to do it. I'm going to try to do this as quickly as I can. And I want to talk about how command and control in war has changed with the advent of nuclear weapons. And I think there's and I'll try to make this as comprehensive as I can in the few minutes I have left. But the fact of the matter is this. We saw nuclear weapons being created in 1903, in that time when we start to get a picture of what an atom is. In 1939, fission is achieved before World War II at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Of course, that will lead by 1945 to the fission bombs that we see used in World War II. That is the beginning of what's known as the atomic age. And the atomic age will really come to an issue that we lived with when in 1952 the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb is created, which has literally unlimited capability. You can make a hydrogen bomb as powerful as you wish to make it. The only limiting factor, strangely enough, is once you get to 100 megatons or so, the bomb is so powerful that it can no longer be contained in the atmosphere of the planet, and it actually blows its power into outer space. So at 100 megatons, basically, that's as powerful as you are going to make a hydrogen bomb today. So this brings into many, many factors of change of how to deal with these weapons. And briefly, just a quick example of how this would work today is a thing called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Mutually assured destruction is this. If I launch a first strike, if I'm an insane person, a bad leader, someone that is pushed to the brink, kind of like we would look at maybe Hitler near the end, I will decide that I'm going to destroy everything I can, and I'm going to launch a first strike using these weapons. When I do that, I have two options of how to use those weapons. I can use them either A, to destroy the enemy's capability to launch a second strike. In other words, I will try to hit his missile silos, his air bases, destroy his submarines. Or I can try another option. I can try decapitation. I can try to kill the leadership that controls those weapons. And that would be called a decapitation strike. And that is probably a bigger fear for nation states than anything else. And I say that simply because the most closely guarded secret really in the world is the fact that no one knows, none of us know, what the actual launch procedure is for nuclear weapons in this country. We certainly have no idea what the Soviets or the Russians have to do this. So you can think that you know that the president has the football, but the actual command and control of that is really unknown. That's probably the closest held secret any nuclear power can have, because that is the one thing that will prevent decapitation. As early as 1962, with the movie Dr. Strangelove, you saw this made to be almost comical, but quite honestly black comedy, the fact that this was turned over to computers, that the command and control of nuclear weapons was not even handled by humans any longer, it was handled by computers. So we don't know. If for all we know, really, the final usage of atomic weapons in this country, in this world, in Russia, nobody knows for sure, could have been turned over to computers. There's no way to tell, because that is the closest held secret there is. So when we look at this type of command and control issue, the secondary piece, of course, is going to be if somebody launches a first strike, you have to retaliate. And the retaliation is going to be not to hit their missile silos or to hit their air bases, because all those planes, all those missiles have already been launched. You're not going to hit empty silos. What you're going to do is you're going to hit their cities. You are going to make retaliation so terrible by destroying the cities of your opponents that that is what the second strike is about. So indeed, that creates more issues with command and control. And to give it a good example, I think, if we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think many of you grew up in the duck and cover era, where you were told to get under your desk and stay away from the window, and somehow that would protect you from a thermonuclear bomb. Certainly, I think probably the best thing it would have done is you could have bent over and kissed your butt goodbye, because that's about all it was going to get you. But the fact of the matter is, the Cuban Missile Crisis, what is going on? The Russians are going to deploy intermediate range ballistic missiles on Cuba, so the flight time of those missiles is incredibly short. So those missiles will hit the United States very, very quickly. The United States reacts incredibly aggressively to this, but the Russians have yet to deploy these missiles. So there is I think it's about 2 weeks total before they would have been able to actually deploy them. In that time frame, with that time to save this issue, indeed, that is what saves the world in effect, because we can make a response that is going to be measured. We are going to use a blockade to prevent those missiles from coming in. Today, that is totally changed. Now you can launch submarine missiles from literally off the coast of the United States that will hit key targets in a matter of minutes. So the time frame that you have to react to these situations is very, very, very short. You don't have a lot of time to make decisions. You basically, if you detect a launch, you have no other option but to launch. When the V-2 was being used, Winston Churchill was so angered by the V-2 hitting London without any capability to defend London that he proposed to use poison gas dropped by Bomber Command on German cities. And that was in retaliation for the V-2. He is fortunately, once again, there is time to be talked out of this situation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff tell Winston Churchill, no, this is a bad idea. We cannot do this. Yes, we know you're angry, but the fact of the matter is we cannot resort to this type of retaliation on the German people, dropping poison gas on German cities. And indeed, they do not do that. So that brings us to command and control in the nuclear age. And I'm going to use John Keegan here. He talks about leadership. In the front always, sometimes or never. In the front always would be people like Alexander. Alexander is in the front of his army. He's the king, he's the religious leader, and he's literally leading his army in charges. We have sometimes, that would be people like Wellington at Waterloo. Weapons now have much more range, so you don't get in the front line, you're too likely to be killed because you have to control your army. But indeed, you're very close to it. So you're within range of being killed frequently, and Grant is as well in the American Civil War. So there's sometimes, but then what happens is the ranges get larger and larger and larger. We see that command and control goes to chateau generals. They are literally 50 miles behind the front. The only way they know what's going on is via telephone or people that come in runners and give them communication directly from the field. So they lose touch with their military virtually completely, and this leads to perhaps the revolt of the French army in 1917. Indeed, that is a major problem because the French army feels that they have been abandoned by their leadership. And when Keegan talks about actual leadership, he says, command is ultimately straightforward. Its exercise turns on the recognition that those that are asked to die must not be left to feel that they die alone. So in other words, people need to be led by leadership that they think that there is going to take care of them, is fighting for a reason, is willing to risk their lives as well. Well, in the nuclear age, we see now that generals and armies have really lost their place. It is now who is in charge of the nuclear weapons, which is the political leaders. The political leaders have now superseded the generals as being the defenders of the country. Yes, armies have a place. Armies are part of the military. But the fact of the matter is, in this world, they have not got the importance that they once had as political leaders that have this power. And they have a truly critical command function of no longer being able to be generals, but to the center of political power itself. Those exercising sovereign authority now have the fate of millions of people in their hands. If they should miscalculate or fail, loss of life will be unprecedented. So, if there's a madman and he launches a first strike, that is a huge problem for the world. Even people, as much as I respect Winston Churchill, in a moment of anger, he was willing to drop poison gas on German civilians. This puts command and control in a very, very tough position because now the ability to have this power is literally in minutes. So that is a huge, huge issue. And so the political leaders today have all in effect become Alexanders. They no longer have just the political power, they have ultimate military power as well. So what happens though with Alexanders is it's totally different in that our political leaders are not going to be in the front lines with the sword in hand attacking the enemy. No. The people that are going to be in the front lines are those least prepared and least involved. It is going to be women, children, all civilians that are going to be in the front lines of future war. And the leadership of our wars, in fact, they will be in flying command posts or deep in bunkers. In fact, they will be amongst the few to survive. And we can see here the famous doomsday clock, 2.5 minutes to midnight. Indeed, that is a major truth, the fact that we now, because of the Industrial Revolution, have the capability to make weapons of mass destruction. And of course, there is the kneecap aircraft that indeed our leadership will be put in place to. So that, again, I'm not saying that they don't have the reason to be there. They do have the reason to be there. They need to be able to launch that second strike. They need to be able to retaliate. But the timeline has gotten so ridiculously short that just minor miscalculations will lead to disaster. Yes?
I took a class in nuclear warfare,
Uh-huh.
and one of my assignments was take 50 nuclear bombs, maximize the population kill. And the reason we took 50 was, in large part, one submarine survives.
Right.
I could kill, if I'm remembering right, 40% of the U.S. population with 50 nuclear warheads.
Sure. And the capability right now the Russians have is 6,500.
Right, and so basically, if you think about it, the retaliatory strike to be of epic proportions is the survival of one submarine.
Right. That's all it takes. but you still have to control that submarine. So that's why the decapitation is so critical.
Right.
So quickly, and I will leave you with this. So the first and second industrial revolution have led to these weapons of mass destruction. And indeed, to quote once again John Keegan, mankind needs not new hardware, but a change of heart. It needs an end to the ethic of heroism and its leadership for good and all. And with that, I thank you for attending all 15 of these classes. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
You talked about, well, we see these new hypersonic missiles coming online, supposedly, there's the news a lot. They can get on target from far away in a matter of only a few minutes.
Right.
But that's about the same warning time available from standoff submarines.
A standoff submarine, I've heard numbers as low as 15 minutes to hit Washington. So that's how much time you've got to make a decision what you're going to do. That's why it's so outrageous now. I mean, like I said, you had time previously. You always had more time to make rational decisions. Now a bad actor, a maniac, whatever, a Hitler can destroy pretty much everything in a matter of minutes, and there's no defense. If the bomber would always get through, guarantee you, atomic weapons, regardless of how they're deployed, will always get through. You could bring it in a suitcase.
So the hypersonic missile flies at a fairly low altitude.
No, they're pretty high. Yeah, they need to have less resistance to the wind. That's why they fly very high. They just fly real fast. And again, they.
Supposed time, the warning time available if those are deployed.
We don't technically have a hypersonic capability right now. The Russians claim to. I'm not sure if they actually have that capability, or they're certainly saying they have that capability. But again, I just don't see it as a need, really. I guess it's nice to have, but.
I'm not advocating one way or the other.
But I mean, I don't see why bother with it when you already have ICBMs. In other words, the thought process is it's easier to shoot down an ICBM because of its terminal guidance. But you've got MIRVs, multiple reentry vehicles. You've got MARVs; they're maneuverable. So I don't see it as being a huge value. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I certainly appreciate it. Hopefully, you learned as much as I did creating this class. Again, thank you.